The heavy iron key clicked in the lock of the cellar door, as Josephine Lawson felt the last of her hope vanish with the retreating footsteps of her stepfather. At 18, she had never imagined she would end up a prisoner in her own home, her cries smothered by thick wooden beams and earth, her future as dark as the cellar that now confined her. Rock Springs, Wyoming Territory, 1875. The town had grown rapidly since the Union Pacific Railroad had established it as a coal mining settlement. What had once been little more than a water stop was now a bustling community with businesses, saloons, and settlers from all over seeking fortune or escape. For Josephine, it had been neither. Instead, it had become her prison when her mother had married Gerald Thompson 2 years prior. Josephine shivered in the damp cellar, pulling her thin cotton dress tighter around her slender frame. The single oil lamp her stepfather had left provided minimal light and even less warmth. The shelves of preserves and dried goods that lined the walls seemed to mock her with their abundance while she sat hungry on the dirt floor. Her crime: refusing to marry the elderly banker Mr. Hollister, a business associate of her stepfather who had offered a generous sum for her hand. "You'll stay down here until you see reason," Gerald had growled as he shoved her down the wooden steps. "That or until Hollister decides he doesn't want damaged goods." She couldn't be sure how long she'd been in the cellar, already hours, certainly, but the lack of windows made it impossible to track the passage of time. Her mother was away visiting her sister in Denver and wouldn't return for another 2 weeks. By then, Josephine feared, it would be too late. Miles away from the Thompson house, Finn Kincaid guided his horse along the dusty trail leading to Rock Springs. At 24, he had spent the last 6 years working various ranches throughout the West, earning himself a reputation as a skilled horseman and dependable ranch hand. His latest employment had come to an end when the ranch owner sold to a cattle company from Chicago, leaving Finn and several others to seek work elsewhere. Finn had heard that the Diamond Cross Ranch outside Rock Springs was hiring, and with the few dollars he had saved, he figured he could afford a meal and a room for the night before inquiring about work in the morning. His sorrel gelding snorted beneath him, eager to reach town after the long day's ride. "Just a little farther, Rusty," Finn murmured, patting the horse's neck. "Then we'll both get some rest." As they crested a small rise, Finn could see the sprawl of Rock Springs in the valley below, smoke rising from chimneys, the train depot visible even from this distance. He urged Rusty forward, the thought of a hot meal quickening their pace. The trail took them past several outlying properties before reaching town proper. As they approached a modest 2-story house set back from the road, Finn's attention was drawn to a man exiting the house, slamming the door behind him. Something about the man's demeanor, the rigid posture, the aggressive movements as he mounted his horse, put Finn on alert. He slowed Rusty to a walk, watching as the stranger rode off in the direction of town. It wasn't his business, Finn reminded himself. Folks out here kept to themselves, and that was how most preferred it. But as he prepared to continue on his way, a sound caught his ear, faint but unmistakable. A cry for help. Finn reined Rusty to a halt, listening intently. The sound came again, muffled but desperate. It seemed to be coming from the house the stranger had just left. For a moment, Finn hesitated. Getting involved in other people's affairs could lead to trouble, and he'd had enough of that in his life. But the cry came once more, and this time there was no mistaking the fear in the voice. Finn couldn't ignore it. He guided Rusty toward the house, dismounting and tethering him to a post near the front porch. "Hello," Finn called as he approached the door. "Anyone need help?" No response came from inside the house, But again he heard the muffled cry, this time realizing it wasn't coming from within the main structure, but from somewhere below. Finn circled the house, finding a pair of cellar doors set into the ground near the back. Is someone down there? He called, kneeling beside the doors. He tried the latch, finding it secured with a heavy padlock. "Please help me," came a woman's voice, clearer now that he was closer to the source. "He locked me in. Please." Without hesitation, Finn looked around for something to break the lock. Finding nothing suitable nearby, he returned to Rusty and retrieved his saddlebag, which contained a few tools. Among them was a small hatchet he used for making kindling. "Stand back from the door," Finn warned. "I'm going to break the lock." He heard movement below, then the woman's voice again. "I'm clear." Finn brought the hatchet down on the padlock with all his strength. It took 3 solid blows before the metal gave way, the lock falling to the ground with a thud. He pulled the cellar doors open, revealing a set of wooden steps descending into darkness. At the bottom of the stairs stood Josephine, blinking in the sudden sunlight. Her chestnut hair was disheveled, her green eyes wide with both fear and hope as she looked up at her unexpected rescuer. "Thank you," she breathed, her voice shaky. "He would have left me here until morning at least." Finn extended his hand to help her up the stairs. "Who did this to you?" "My stepfather," Josephine replied, accepting his assistance. As she emerged from the cellar, she brushed the dirt from her dress, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance. "He's trying to force me to marry a man old enough to be my grandfather." Finn's jaw tightened. He had seen his share of cruelty in the West, but locking a young woman in a cellar struck him as particularly vile. "Does your mother know about this?" Josephine shook her head. "She's away visiting my aunt. She won't be back for 2 weeks." She looked toward the road, fear returning to her eyes. "He went into town, but he'll be back soon if he finds you here." "I'm not afraid of him," Finn stated, his voice calm but firm, "but I understand your concern." "Do you have somewhere safe you can go?" Josephine hesitated. She had friends in town, but seeking refuge with them would be the first place her stepfather would look. Her aunt lived too far away to reach without proper transportation and supplies. "No," she admitted finally. "I don't." Finn considered their options. "My name's Finn Kincaid," he offered. "I was heading to town to find work at the Diamond Cross Ranch." "I'm Josephine Lawson," she replied. "My mother married Gerald Thompson after my father died in a mining accident 2 years ago." She glanced back at the house. "I can't stay here, but I don't know where to go." Finn made a decision. "I can escort you to town. Maybe the sheriff—" "No," Josephine interrupted quickly. "The sheriff and my stepfather are friends. He wouldn't help me. This complicated matters." Finn ran a hand through his sandy hair, thinking. "Do you have any family nearby, besides your aunt in Denver?" "No, it's just my mother and me now." Josephine wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the afternoon warmth. "I could try to find work as a domestic. I can cook and clean." "First things first," Finn said pragmatically. "We need to get you away from here before your stepfather returns. Grab whatever you need quickly." Josephine nodded and hurried into the house. She emerged minutes later with a small bundle containing a change of clothes, a hairbrush, and a locket that had belonged to her father. She had also changed into a more practical blue dress and added a shawl around her shoulders. "I don't have much," she said apologetically, clutching the small bundle. "It's enough," Finn assured her, helping her mount Rusty. He took the reins and began leading the horse away from the house, choosing a direction opposite to where her stepfather had ridden. "Where are we going?" Josephine asked, clutching the saddle horn to keep her balance. "There's a widow named Mrs. Harper who runs a small boarding house on the outskirts of town," Finn explained. "I stayed there once before. She's a good woman, discreet. She might be willing to take you in until we figure something out." Josephine felt a wave of gratitude toward this stranger who had come to her rescue. "Why are you helping me, Mr. Kincaid?" Finn glanced up at her, his blue eyes meeting her green ones. "I believe in doing what's right, Miss Lawson, and locking someone in a cellar against their will isn't right by any measure." They traveled in silence for a while, keeping to the less traveled paths to avoid being seen. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. Josephine found herself studying her rescuer as they walked. Finn Kincaid moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to the hardships of the frontier. His face, tanned from years under the western sun, bore the weathered lines of someone who smiled often, despite whatever difficulties he had faced. "Have you been in Rock Springs long?" she asked finally, breaking the silence. Finn shook his head. "Just passing through. I worked a cattle drive up from Texas last season, then spent the winter at a ranch near Laramie. When they sold out, I heard Diamond Cross was hiring." "The Carsons own Diamond Cross," Josephine informed him. "They're good people, fair employers from what I've heard." "That's good to know," Finn replied. He hesitated, then added, "If you don't mind my asking, how did you end up in that cellar?" Josephine sighed, the memory still fresh and painful. "My stepfather arranged for me to marry Mr. Hollister, the banker. He's 63 and has buried 2 wives already. When I refused, Gerald, my stepfather, became furious. He said he'd already accepted payment for me, like I was cattle to be sold. When I still refused, he locked me in the cellar and said he'd keep me there until I changed my mind." Finn's expression darkened. "That's not right. You're not property to be bartered. In his eyes, I am. My mother's property and by extension his." When she married him, she had no idea what he was really like. He's charming when he wants to be, especially to her, but when she's not around. Josephine trailed off, not needing to finish the thought. They continued on, the landscape gradually changing as they approached the edge of town. True to Finn's word, a modest boarding house came into view, set back from the main road with a small garden in front. Smoke curled from the chimney, and several chickens pecked at the ground near a side yard. "Wait here," Finn instructed, helping Josephine down from Rusty. He tethered the horse to a post and approached the front door, knocking firmly. The door opened to reveal an older woman with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her face, lined with age, softened when she recognized Finn. "Well, look what the wind blew in," she said, her voice warm with genuine pleasure. "Finn Kincaid, isn't it? You passed through last fall." "Yes, madam. Good memory you have, Mrs. Harper." The woman smiled. "Not many like you come through these parts. What brings you back to Rock Springs?" Finn glanced back at Josephine, who stood uncertainly beside Rusty. "I was hoping to find work at Diamond Cross, but I've run into a situation that needs addressing first. My friend here needs a safe place to stay for a while. It's complicated, Mrs." Harper followed his gaze, her expression turning to concern when she saw Josephine's disheveled state. "Bring her in, then. Complicated situations are nothing new in these parts." Finn gestured for Josephine to join them, and Mrs. Harper ushered them both inside. The boarding house was modest but clean, with a sitting room that opened to a dining area where a long table was set for the evening meal. The aroma of stew simmering on the stove filled the air, making Josephine suddenly aware of how hungry she was. "You're just in time for supper, Mrs." Harper said as if reading her thoughts. "But first, let's get you settled. I have a room available upstairs." "Thank you, Mrs. Harper," Finn said. "I can pay for her lodging." "We'll discuss payment after you've eaten," the older woman replied, leading Josephine toward the stairs. "For now, you can use the washroom to freshen up. I'll bring some hot water." Left alone in the sitting room, Finn took a moment to consider their situation. He had planned to secure work and move on, not to become entangled in a young woman's troubles. Yet something about Josephine Lawson stirred a protective instinct in him that he couldn't ignore. Her stepfather's actions were reprehensible, and Finn couldn't stand by knowing she might be forced back into that situation. When Mrs. Harper returned, her expression was grave. "That poor girl's been through something terrible, hasn't she?" Finn nodded. "Her stepfather locked her in a cellar for refusing to marry some old banker. Her mother's away, and she has nowhere else to go." "Gerald Thompson," Mrs. Harper said, surprising Finn. "I recognize her now. Josephine Lawson. Her mother married that snake Thompson after Jacob Lawson died in the mine collapse." She shook her head sadly. "Never trusted that man. Now I know why." "You know her?" Finn asked. "Rock Springs isn't that big, young man. I make it my business to know the folks who live here." Mrs. Harper's eyes narrowed. "Thompson's got influence in this town. Money talks, especially with men like Sheriff Davis, who's more interested in keeping his job than doing it properly." This confirmed what Josephine had said about the sheriff. "So the law won't help her?" "Not likely. But that doesn't mean she's without options." Mrs. Harper's expression softened slightly. "She can stay here as long as needed. I've got a spare room and I could use help with the cooking and cleaning. It would give her purpose while she figures out her next steps." Finn felt relief wash over him. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper. I'll pay for her board." "We'll work something out," the older woman assured him. "Now, will you be staying as well?" Finn hesitated. He needed to find work and soon, but he also felt responsible for Josephine's safety. For tonight, at least. "I need to speak with the folks at Diamond Cross tomorrow." Mrs. Harper nodded approvingly. "Good. I've got a room for you too. Now come help me set the table. The other boarders will be in for supper soon." By the time Josephine came downstairs, dressed in her clean change of clothes with her hair neatly brushed, the table was set, and several other boarders had gathered for the evening meal. Mrs. Harper had 4 regular tenants: Mr. Parsons, a clerk at the general store; the widow Jeffries, who supplemented her income by taking in sewing; and the Brady brothers, James and Thomas, who worked at the coal mine. Mrs. Harper introduced Josephine simply as a new boarder, offering no explanation for her sudden arrival. The others accepted this without question, making room for her at the table. Finn noticed that Josephine kept her eyes lowered during most of the meal, speaking only when directly addressed. The ordeal had clearly shaken her, and he wondered how long it would take for her to feel safe again. After supper, while the other boarders retired to their rooms or the sitting room, Finn and Josephine slipped outside to the small porch at the back of the house. The evening was cool, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of sage. "Mrs. Harper says I can stay and work for my keep," Josephine told him, her voice steadier than it had been earlier. "She's been very kind." "She's a good woman," Finn agreed. "Will you be all right here?" Josephine nodded, though uncertainty still clouded her eyes. "For now. But Gerald won't stop looking for me. He's invested too much in his arrangement with Mr. Hollister to let me go easily." Finn leaned against the porch railing, considering her words. "Your mother returns in 2 weeks, you said. Could she help, maybe? She loves me, but she's fragile. After my father died, she fell apart. Gerald seemed like stability to her. I'm not sure she'd believe me over him or have the strength to stand against him if she did." Josephine sighed, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "What will you do now, Mr. Kincaid?" "Finn, please," he corrected gently. "I'll head out to Diamond Cross tomorrow, see about work, but I won't be far and I'll check on you when I can." "You don't have to do that," Josephine protested weakly. "You've already done more than enough." "I'd feel better knowing you're safe," Finn insisted. Besides, Mrs. Harper's is on the way between the ranch and town. It won't be any trouble." The gratitude in Josephine's eyes made something shift in Finn's chest. In his years of drifting from ranch to ranch, he'd learned not to form attachments to places or to people. Yet something about this young woman's courage in the face of such cruelty touched him deeply. "Thank you, Finn," she said softly. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along when you did." "Let's not think about that," he replied. "What matters is what happens next, and I promise you, Miss Lawson, you won't have to face it alone." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they stood in companionable silence, each contemplating the unexpected turn their lives had taken. For Josephine, it was the first taste of freedom she'd had since her mother's remarriage. For Finn, it was a reminder that sometimes the path a man chooses isn't always the one he ends up walking. Morning came with a soft golden glow filtering through the curtains of Josephine's room at the boarding house. For a disorienting moment, she didn't recognize her surroundings, half expecting to find herself still in the dark cellar. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back her imprisonment, the cowboy who had freed her, and Mrs. Harper's kindness in taking her in. She dressed quickly in her second dress, a simple brown cotton with modest lace trim at the collar and cuffs. It had been her mother's, altered to fit Josephine's more slender frame, and though it was somewhat outdated, it was clean and presentable. After braiding her hair and pinning it up, she made her way downstairs to help with breakfast. Mrs. Harper was already in the kitchen, stoking the fire in the cookstove. She greeted Josephine with a warm smile. "Good morning, dear. Did you sleep well?" "Better than I expected," Josephine admitted. "Thank you again for taking me in." "Nonsense. I'm happy for the help and happier still to keep you away from that stepfather of yours." Mrs. Harper handed her an apron. "Now, if you could start the biscuits, I'll see to the bacon and eggs." The men like a hearty breakfast before heading off to work. As they prepared the morning meal, Mrs. Harper explained the routine of the boarding house. Breakfast was served promptly at 6, lunch baskets were prepared for those who worked through midday, and supper was at 6 in the evening. Between meals, there was cleaning, laundry, gardening, and various other chores to keep the place running smoothly. "I used to manage it all myself," Mrs. Harper said, "but these old bones aren't what they used to be. Having you here will be a blessing." By the time the other boarders came down for breakfast, the table was laid with fresh biscuits, scrambled eggs, bacon, and coffee. Finn was among the last to arrive, dressed for riding with his hat in hand. His eyes found Josephine immediately, a question in them that she answered with a small nod. She was all right. "I'm heading out to Diamond Cross after breakfast," he announced as he took a seat. "With luck, I'll have work by noon." "Carson's a fair man," Mr. Parsons commented, helping himself to the eggs. "If he's hiring and you know cattle, you'll do fine." Breakfast conversation flowed around topics of local interest, the price of coal, the new shipment of goods expected at the general store, the upcoming dance at the town hall. Josephine listened attentively, grateful for the normalcy after her ordeal. No one mentioned her stepfather or questioned her presence, for which she was deeply thankful. After the meal, as the boarders dispersed to their various employments, Finn lingered. He approached Josephine as she cleared the table, his voice low. "I'll be back this evening if all goes well at Diamond Cross. Will you be all right until then?" "Yes," she assured him. "Mrs. Harper has plenty for me to do, and I doubt Gerald will think to look for me here." Finn nodded, though concern still shadowed his features. "If there's trouble, any kind at all, send word to Diamond Cross. Ask for Finn Kincaid." "I will," Josephine promised. "Good luck with Mr. Carson." With a tip of his hat, Finn departed, leaving Josephine to her new duties. The day passed quickly, as she immersed herself in the rhythm of the boarding house, washing dishes, sweeping floors, helping Mrs. Harper prepare lunch baskets, and learning the particulars of each boarder's preferences. The work was honest and straightforward, a welcome change from the tense atmosphere of her stepfather's house. In the afternoon, while hanging laundry in the yard, Josephine caught sight of a familiar figure riding down the main road toward town. Her heart leaped into her throat as she recognized Gerald Thompson, his rigid posture unmistakable even at a distance. She ducked behind a sheet, holding her breath until he had passed. When she returned inside, her hands were shaking. Mrs. Harper noticed immediately. "What's wrong, child? You look like you've seen a ghost." "My stepfather just rode past," Josephine explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's looking for me, I'm sure of it." Mrs. Harper's face hardened. "He won't find you here. This house sits back from the road and he has no reason to come calling." She patted Josephine's hand reassuringly. "Besides, I've got my late husband's shotgun and I know how to use it." The older woman's fierce protectiveness brought tears to Josephine's eyes. "I don't want to bring trouble to your door." "Trouble finds its way regardless, Mrs. Harper replied philosophically. "Better to face it with friends than alone. Now help me with these potatoes for supper. Your Mr. Kincaid will be hungry when he returns." "He's not my Mr. Kincaid," Josephine protested, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "Mrs. Harper merely smiled knowingly and handed her a potato peeler. The remainder of the day passed without incident, though Josephine found herself checking the road frequently. As promised, Finn returned shortly before supper time, his expression triumphant as he entered the kitchen where Josephine and Mrs. Harper were finishing meal preparations. "I got the job," he announced. "Started today, in fact. Mr. Carson needed hands right away for a cattle drive next week." "That's wonderful news," Josephine said sincerely, relieved that her predicament hadn't cost him an opportunity. "Indeed it is," Mrs. Harper agreed. "Wash up, young man. Supper's nearly ready." As Finn headed to the washroom, Mrs. Harper gave Josephine a meaningful look. "He's a good one, that Finn Kincaid. Not many would go out of their way for a stranger like he did for you." Josephine couldn't argue with that assessment. In a land where self-reliance was prized above all else, Finn's willingness to help her had been extraordinary. That he continued to show concern for her welfare touched her deeply. Supper that evening was a lively affair, with Finn sharing stories of his first day at Diamond Cross, and the other boarders contributing their own tales of the day's events. Josephine found herself laughing for the first time in what felt like ages, the weight of her situation temporarily lifted by the camaraderie around the table. After the meal, while the others settled in the sitting room, Finn and Josephine again sought the privacy of the back porch. The evening was clear, with stars emerging one by one in the darkening sky. "I saw Gerald in town today," Finn said without preamble. "He was asking questions at the general store, describing you to the clerk." Josephine's momentary peace evaporated. "I saw him ride past earlier. Did he see you?" "No, I kept out of sight, but he's definitely looking for you and he seems determined." Finn's expression was grave. "The good news is, no one at the store gave him any information. It seems your stepfather isn't well liked in town." "That doesn't surprise me. He treats everyone like they're beneath him, except those he wants something from." Josephine sighed, leaning against the porch post. "What am I going to do, Finn? I can't hide forever." "No, you can't," he agreed. "Eventually, you'll need to confront the situation, but not alone." Finn hesitated, then asked, "When does your mother return from Denver?" "Not for another 2 weeks, at least. And even then—" Josephine's voice trailed off, her doubt about her mother's ability to stand up to Gerald evident. Finn considered this information. 2 weeks gives us time to figure something out. In the meantime, you're safe here with Mrs. Harper." "Us?" Josephine questioned, catching his choice of words. "Yes, us," Finn confirmed. "I'm not going to abandon you to face this alone, Josephine." The sincerity in his voice warmed her, and for the first time since her ordeal began, Josephine felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps, with Finn's help, she could find a way out of the trap her stepfather had set for her. "Thank you," she said simply, the words inadequate to express her gratitude. Finn smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something truly handsome. "You're welcome. Now tell me about your day. How did you find life as Mrs. Harper's assistant?" Their conversation turned to lighter topics, and as they talked, Josephine found herself studying Finn more carefully. In the soft glow of the porch lantern, his features were strong and defined: a straight nose, firm jaw, and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. His hands, when he gestured to emphasize a point, were calloused from hard work but gentle in movement. It occurred to Josephine that under different circumstances, she might have been drawn to this man in a way that had nothing to do with gratitude. The thought startled her, and she quickly pushed it aside. Her situation was precarious enough without complicating it with such feelings. As the evening grew cooler, they reluctantly returned inside. The other boarders had already retired for the night, leaving the sitting room quiet and dim. Mrs. Harper had left a lamp burning low for their return. "I should get some rest," Josephine said, suddenly feeling awkward in Finn's presence. "Morning comes early." "That it does," Finn agreed. "Good night, Josephine. Sleep well." "Good night, Finn." As she climbed the stairs to her room, Josephine couldn't help but reflect on the strange turn her life had taken. Yesterday morning, she had woken in her own bed, dreading another day under her stepfather's watchful eye. Tonight, she was a fugitive of sorts, dependent on the kindness of virtual strangers. Yet somehow, despite the uncertainty of her situation, she felt freer than she had in the 2 years since her mother's remarriage. In the privacy of her small room, Josephine allowed herself to consider what might come next. Could she build a life here, working for Mrs. Harper? Would her mother side with her when she returned and learned what Gerald had done? And what of Finn Kincaid, the cowboy who had heard her cries and broken the cellar door? These questions followed her into sleep, where her dreams were a confused mixture of dark cellars, open skies, and a pair of kind blue eyes that seemed to promise safety. The next few days settled into a rhythm for Josephine. She rose early to help Mrs. Harper with breakfast, spent the day tending to the boarding house chores, and enjoyed the company of the other boarders in the evening. Finn returned each night from Diamond Cross, always with a question about her well-being and often with news from town. Gerald Thompson continued his search, becoming increasingly frustrated as the days passed without sign of his stepdaughter. Finn reported that the banker, Mr. Hollister, was pressuring Gerald to produce Josephine or return his payment, adding financial urgency to Gerald's already considerable anger. "He's offering a reward now," Finn told Josephine on the 4th evening as they sat on their customary spot on the back porch. $20 to anyone who can tell him where you are." Josephine's stomach twisted with anxiety. "Someone will talk. Money loosens tongues." "Maybe," Finn conceded, "but it also makes people suspicious. Half the town thinks he's done something terrible to you, given how desperate he is to find you. The other half just doesn't like him enough to help, reward or no." This was small comfort to Josephine, who knew her stepfather well enough to understand that his determination would only grow with each passing day. "I can't stay hidden forever," she said, voicing the thought that had been troubling her. "Sooner or later, someone will see me or Mrs. Harper will slip and say something, or Or you could leave Rock Springs, Finn suggested quietly. Josephine looked at him in surprise. Leave and go where? Denver, maybe, to your aunt's, or further east, St. Louis, Chicago. Finn's expression was thoughtful. The West is full of places where a person can start fresh. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. Josephine had never traveled more than a day's journey from Rock Springs in her life. The thought of striking out alone for distant cities was daunting. Yet the alternative, being forced to marry Mr. Hollister or facing Gerald's wrath, was worse. I don't have money for such a journey, she pointed out practically. And I know no one in those places. Finn was quiet for a moment, considering. The cattle drive. I'm joining heads to Cheyenne next week. From there, you could catch a train east if you wanted. You're suggesting I go with the cattle drive? Josephine asked, incredulous. Not exactly with it, Finn clarified, but I could arrange transportation. One of the ranch hands has a wagon he's taking along. His sister's traveling with him already. You could join them. The possibility of escape tempted Josephine, yet she hesitated. What about my mother? I can't just vanish without telling her what happened. You could write to her, Finn suggested. Explain everything. By the time she returns to Rock Springs, you'd be safely away. Josephine considered this option. A letter would allow her to tell her side of the story without Gerald's interference. Whether her mother would believe her over her husband was another matter entirely, but at least she would know Josephine hadn't simply run off without reason. I'll think about it, she promised. It's a big decision. Finn nodded, understanding the weight of what he was proposing. Take your time. But not too much. The drive leaves in 4 days. Their conversation shifted to other topics, but the idea of leaving Rock Springs continued to occupy Josephine's thoughts. That night, as she lay in bed, she tried to imagine what her life might be like away from the only home she'd ever known. It was both frightening and liberating to contemplate such freedom. The following morning, as Josephine was hanging laundry in the yard, a familiar voice called her name. She froze, the wet sheet in her hands dripping onto the dusty ground. Josephine, there you are, you ungrateful girl. Gerald Thompson stood at the garden gate, his face twisted with anger. Behind him, 2 other men waited on horseback, one of whom Josephine recognized as Sheriff Davis. Mrs. Harper, Josephine called, her voice tight with fear. Mrs. Harper, please. The older woman appeared at the back door, wiping her hands on her apron. When she saw Gerald, her expression hardened. Mr. Thompson, this is private property. I'll thank you to leave. I've come for my stepdaughter, Gerald announced, pointing at Josephine. She ran away from home, causing me no end of worry. Is that so? Mrs. Harper's voice was deceptively mild as she moved to stand beside Josephine. Funny, I heard she was locked in a cellar against her will. Gerald's face reddened. That's a lie, Sheriff. You see how it is. The girl's been filling people's heads with nonsense. Sheriff Davis dismounted, looking uncomfortable. Mrs. Harper, I understand you're trying to help, but Mr. Thompson is the girl's legal guardian while her mother's away. If he says she needs to come home, I'm obliged to enforce that. She's 18, Mrs. Harper countered, old enough to decide for herself where she wants to be. The sheriff frowned, clearly not having considered this angle. Is that true, Miss Lawson? Are you 18? Yes, Josephine confirmed, finding her voice. I turned 18 in April. Gerald's anger visibly increased. That's irrelevant. She's unmarried and living under my roof. Her mother left her in my care. And you tried to sell her to Albert Hollister, Mrs. Harper shot back, her patience clearly at an end. Everyone in town knows you took money from him, promising Josephine's hand without her consent. The sheriff looked increasingly uncomfortable as this accusation was laid bare. Mr. Thompson, is there any truth to this? Hollister made an offer for her hand, yes, Gerald admitted grudgingly. It's a perfectly respectable arrangement. Which I refused, Josephine added, her fear giving way to anger. So he locked me in the cellar until I would agree, or until Mr. Hollister decided he didn't want damaged goods, as he put it. This damning statement hung in the air, creating a palpable tension. Sheriff Davis looked from Josephine to Gerald, clearly weighing the situation. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Lawson," he said finally. "It's the truth," Josephine insisted, meeting his gaze directly. Before the sheriff could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew everyone's attention. Finn appeared on Rusty, riding hard up the path to the boarding house. He dismounted quickly, moving to stand protectively near Josephine. "What's going on here?" he demanded, taking in the scene with a glance. "This is none of your concern, Cowboy," Gerald snapped. "This is a family matter." "It became my concern when I found Miss Lawson locked in a cellar 4 days ago," Finn replied evenly. "And it remains my concern now." The sheriff's eyebrows rose at this new information. "You're the one who helped her escape." "I freed a woman who was being held prisoner against her will," Finn corrected. "There's a difference." The tension in the yard was thick enough to cut with a knife. Gerald glared at Finn with undisguised hatred, while the sheriff seemed increasingly conflicted about his role in the situation. "Sheriff," Mrs. Harper spoke up, her voice calm but firm. "Josephine is 18 years old. She's working here at my boarding house of her own free will. There's no law that says she must return to a man who locked her in a cellar for refusing to marry someone against her wishes." Sheriff Davis sighed, removing his hat to run a hand through his thinning hair. "She's right about that, Thompson. If the girl's 18 and chooses to stay here, there's not much I can do legally." "This is absurd," Gerald exploded. "She's my responsibility until she's married. Clara left her in my care. And you betrayed that trust when you tried to force her into marriage for your own financial gain, Mrs. Harper countered, Gerald's face contorted with rage. He turned to Josephine, his voice low and threatening. "Your mother will hear about this. When she gets back, she'll learn exactly what you did," Josephine interrupted, her voice stronger than she felt. "Every detail." For a moment it seemed Gerald might lunge at her, but the presence of the sheriff and Finn checked his impulse. Instead, he spat on the ground at her feet. "You'll regret this," he promised, his voice cold. "Both of you." His gaze included Finn in the threat. Without another word, he turned and stalked back to his horse. The sheriff, after an awkward nod to Mrs. Harper, followed suit. The third man, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, trailed after them. As they rode away, Josephine's knees gave out. She would have fallen if Finn hadn't caught her arm, supporting her weight. "It's all right," he murmured. "They're gone." "For now," she whispered, shaking with delayed reaction. "But Gerald won't give up so easily, Mrs. Harper took her other arm, and together they guided her to the porch, where she sank onto a bench. "You handled yourself well," the older woman praised her. "Standing up to that bully couldn't have been easy." Finn knelt in front of her, his expression concerned. "Are you all right?" Josephine managed a weak smile. "I will be, but I think you're right, Finn. I can't stay in Rock Springs." The decision, once made, brought a strange sense of calm. Josephine spent the rest of the day making preparations for departure, washing and mending her 2 dresses, writing a lengthy letter to her mother explaining everything that had happened, and helping Mrs. Harper train the widow Jeffries to take over her duties at the boarding house. Finn, meanwhile, arranged for her passage with the wagon train that would accompany the cattle drive. The ranch hand with the wagon, a man named Curtis Jenkins, agreed to let Josephine travel with his sister Abigail to Cheyenne for a modest fee, which Finn paid from his own wages. "You didn't have to do that," Josephine protested when he told her. I could have worked to pay my way. Consider it an investment in your future, Finn replied with a smile. Besides, I owe Curtis a favor from way back. He was happy to call it even. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. Mrs. Harper insisted on giving Josephine several small gifts to ease her journey: a warm shawl, a basket of food for the trail, and a small amount of money for emergencies. The other boarders, who had come to learn the full story of her situation, contributed what they could as well. Mr. Parsons brought a new hair ribbon from the general store. The widow Jeffries sewed a practical travel bag, and the Brady brothers pooled their resources to give her a small pocket knife for protection. Finn was busy at Diamond Cross, preparing for the cattle drive, but he rode to the boarding house each evening to check on Josephine and update her on the preparations. Their conversations on the back porch had become a ritual, a quiet space where they could speak freely about their hopes and fears. "What will you do when you reach Cheyenne?" Finn asked on the night before their departure. "I'm not sure yet," Josephine admitted. "I have enough money for a train ticket to Denver where I could stay with my aunt, or I might find work in Cheyenne itself. I've learned a lot from Mrs. Harper. I could seek employment at a boarding house or hotel." Finn nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Cheyenne's growing fast. There should be opportunities there." A question that had been weighing on Josephine's mind finally found voice. "What about you, Finn? After the cattle drive, where will you go?" He shrugged, the gesture casual yet somehow containing a lifetime of wandering. "Wherever the work takes me, I suppose. That's how it's been since I left home at 16. Don't you ever want to settle somewhere?" Josephine asked, genuinely curious. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but it never seemed practical. A cowboy's life doesn't lend itself to putting down roots." The unspoken hung between them that their paths, which had crossed so unexpectedly, would likely diverge again after Cheyenne. The thought brought an unexpected pang of sadness to Josephine's heart. "I'm grateful our paths crossed when they did," she said softly. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't heard me that day." Finn's eyes met hers, something unreadable in their depths. "I'm grateful too, though I wish it had been under better circumstances." The moment stretched between them, charged with things neither was ready to say. Finally, Finn cleared his throat and stood. "We should get some rest. Dawn comes early and it's a long journey to Cheyenne." Josephine nodded, rising as well. "Good night, Finn, and thank you for everything." "Good night, Josephine," he replied, his voice gentle. "Try to get some sleep." Sleep proved elusive, however, as Josephine lay in bed considering the journey ahead. Tomorrow, she would leave the only home she had ever known, heading into an uncertain future. The prospect was both terrifying and exhilarating. For the first time in her life, she was making her own choices, charting her own course. That freedom had come at a high price, but as she finally drifted off to sleep, Josephine found she didn't regret it. Dawn broke clear and cool with a promise of heat later in the day. Josephine dressed in her sturdier brown dress, pinned her hair securely, and packed her few belongings in the travel bag the widow Jeffries had made for her. The letter to her mother she placed on top, intending to mail it from the post office before they left town. Mrs. Harper had prepared a special breakfast, with fresh biscuits, ham, and eggs. "You'll need your strength for the journey," she insisted, pressing second helpings on both Josephine and Finn, who had arrived just before daybreak. The other boarders, despite the early hour, had all come down to see Josephine off. There were handshakes and good wishes, and from Mrs. Harper, a fierce embrace that conveyed more than words could express. "You're welcome back anytime," the older woman told her, pressing a handkerchief to her eyes. "This will always be a safe harbor for you." "Thank you," Josephine whispered, her own eyes damp, "for everything." With final farewells exchanged, Finn helped Josephine onto Rusty. She would ride with him to the Diamond Cross Ranch, where they would join the cattle drive already assembling. The morning air was crisp, the sun just beginning to warm the land as they set off, Josephine's arms wrapped securely around Finn's waist. They stopped briefly at the post office, where Josephine mailed her letter to her mother. Then they continued on, taking a route that avoided passing her stepfather's house. The town of Rock Springs fell behind them, and open country stretched ahead. Josephine found herself studying the landscape with new eyes. The rugged terrain, which she had always taken for granted, now seemed beautiful in its harsh way. Sagebrush dotted the rolling hills, interspersed with patches of grass and occasional stands of aspen or pine. In the distance, mountains rose against the sky, their peaks still bearing traces of last winter's snow. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Finn remarked, as if reading her thoughts. "This country gets under your skin after a while." "Yes," Josephine agreed. "I never really noticed before. I was always too busy with chores and obligations to just look." Finn chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest against her arms. "That's the trick to appreciating the West. You have to take time to look." They rode in companionable silence for a while, until the buildings of Diamond Cross Ranch came into view in the valley below. Even from a distance, Josephine could see that it was a substantial operation, with a large main house, several bunkhouses, barns, corrals, and outbuildings. Men on horseback moved about the property, and a sizable herd of cattle was being gathered in a large pasture. "That's a lot of cattle," she observed. "About 2,000 head," Finn confirmed. "Mr. Carson's driving them to Cheyenne to meet the buyers from the eastern markets. It's good timing, beef prices are high right now." As they approached the ranch, Josephine felt a flutter of anxiety. Until now, her escape had been relatively private, known only to those at Mrs. Harper's boarding house. Joining the cattle drive meant meeting new people, all of whom would naturally wonder about a young woman traveling alone. What would she tell them? How much of her story should she share? Finn, sensing her tension, glanced back at her. "Don't worry. Curtis and Abigail Jenkins are good people. I've explained enough that they understand you're leaving a difficult situation. They won't pry further." His reassurance helped, but Josephine still felt apprehensive as they rode into the ranch yard. Several cowboys looked up from their tasks, their curiosity evident as they spotted a woman riding with Finn. A tall, lean man with graying hair and a weathered face approached them, his expression questioning. "Kincaid, didn't expect you to bring company," he said, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp with assessment. "Mr. Carson, this is Miss Josephine Lawson." Finn introduced her as he dismounted, then helped her down from Rusty. "She'll be traveling with Curtis and Abigail's wagon to Cheyenne." Marshal Carson studied Josephine for a moment, then nodded. "Curtis mentioned as much. Welcome to Diamond Cross, Miss Lawson." "Thank you, Mr. Carson," Josephine replied, relieved by his matter-of-fact acceptance. "The Jenkinses are over by the chuck wagon, getting their supplies sorted," Carson informed them. "Kincaid, once you've got Miss Lawson settled, see Foreman Ross about your assignment for the drive." With that, he tipped his hat to Josephine and strode away, his attention already shifting to the myriad details that required his oversight before the drive could begin. Finn led Josephine through the busy ranch yard, guiding her toward a sturdy wagon where a man and woman were loading supplies. As they approached, the woman looked up and smiled, waving them over. Abigail Jenkins proved to be a friendly, practical woman in her early 30s, with sun-browned skin and laugh lines around her eyes. Her brother Curtis was similarly weathered but with a quieter demeanor. They welcomed Josephine warmly, showing her the space in the wagon where she could stow her bag. "We'll be traveling a bit behind the herd," Abigail explained. "Less dust that way, and we can keep a steadier pace. The chuck wagon will go ahead to have meals ready when the drovers bring the cattle in for the night." Josephine nodded, trying to absorb all the information about trail life. It was so far removed from anything she had experienced before. "How long will the journey take?" she asked. "About 2 weeks, give or take," Curtis replied. "Depends on the weather and how the cattle behave. Sometimes they get spooked and scatter, which can set us back a day or more while we round them up again." The enormity of the undertaking suddenly struck Josephine. 2 weeks on the trail, sleeping under the stars, facing whatever challenges the journey might present. It was both exciting and intimidating. "Don't worry," Abigail said, noticing her expression. "The first few days are the hardest. After that, you'll settle into the rhythm of it." With Josephine's introduction to the Jenkinses complete, Finn reluctantly prepared to leave her to find Foreman Ross. "I'll check on you later," he promised, "once I know my assignment for the drive." "Thank you," Josephine replied, feeling suddenly vulnerable at the prospect of his departure, even if only temporarily. As if understanding her unspoken fear, Finn added quietly, "You're safe here, Josephine. Carson runs a tight outfit. No one will bother you." With that reassurance, he left to attend to his duties, leaving Josephine to help Abigail organize the wagon for the journey ahead. The work was practical and absorbing, giving her little time to dwell on anxieties about the future or regrets about the past. By midday, the cattle drive was ready to move out. The herd, a sea of brown and white shapes, flowed across the landscape under the guidance of experienced cowboys. The chuck wagon led the way, followed by the remuda spare horses for the drovers. Curtis and Abigail's wagon, with Josephine aboard, brought up the rear of the procession. From her seat beside Abigail on the wagon bench, Josephine searched the moving mass of cattle and riders, trying to spot Finn. Abigail noticed her scrutiny and smiled knowingly. "Your friend Kincaid will be riding flank or swing today," she explained. "New hands usually don't get point or drag positions until they've proven themselves." Josephine nodded, though the terms meant little to her. "Will we see him at all during the journey?" "Oh, sure. The men rotate positions and they all come in for meals when the herd's settled." Abigail's smile widened slightly. "He seems very concerned for your welfare." Josephine felt a blush warming her cheeks. "He's been kind to me. I owe him a great deal." Hum," Abigail hummed, her tone suggesting she suspected there was more to it than simple kindness. But she didn't press further, for which Josephine was grateful. As the wagon rolled forward, following the dust cloud raised by thousands of hooves, Josephine took one last look back at Rock Springs, now just a collection of distant buildings on the horizon. She had lived her entire life in that town, and now she was leaving it behind, perhaps forever. The thought brought a mixture of emotion, sadness for what she was leaving, fear of the unknown ahead, but also a growing sense of freedom and possibility. Turning back to face the trail before them, Josephine squared her shoulders. Whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms. And for now, that was enough. The first day on the trail passed in a blur of new experiences for Josephine. The steady creaking of the wagon, the distant calls of the cowboys to the cattle, the vast open landscape stretching in all directions. It was a world entirely different from the confined domesticity she had known in Rock Springs. By evening, when the trail boss called a halt near a creek that provided both water and grazing for the cattle, Josephine's muscles ached from the constant motion of the wagon over rough terrain. She was grateful when Abigail showed her how to set up their small tent, a task that distracted her from her discomfort. The chuck wagon had gone ahead and already had supper cooking when they arrived at the campsite. The aroma of beans, bacon, and coffee drew the cowboys in as they finished settling the herd for the night. Josephine helped Abigail distribute tin plates and cups to the men as they lined up for food. She spotted Finn among them, dusty and tired-looking but with a smile that brightened when he saw her. He made his way to her side after getting his meal. "How was your first day on the trail?" he asked, genuine concern in his voice. "Different," Josephine admitted with a small laugh. "Everything hurts and I'm covered in dust, but it's also exhilarating in a strange way." Finn's smile widened. "You'll toughen up. By the time we reach Cheyenne, you'll be an old hand at this." They ate together near the Jenkinses' wagon, joined by Abigail and a few other cowboys who were curious about the new addition to their company. Josephine was relieved to find that no one asked intrusive questions about why she was traveling to Cheyenne. Whether this was due to Finn's protective presence or simply the frontier custom of respecting privacy, she couldn't be sure, but she was grateful nonetheless. As darkness fell, the camp quieted. Most of the cowboys turned in early, knowing they would be roused before dawn to begin another day's drive. Abigail retired to the tent she shared with Josephine, leaving her alone with Finn by the dying campfire. "You should get some rest," he advised, noticing her unsuccessfully stifled yawn. "The second day is always harder than the first." "In a minute," Josephine replied, reluctant to end this moment of peace. The night sky above them was spectacular, a vast canopy of stars unmarred by the smoke or lights of town. "I've never seen so many stars." Finn followed her gaze upward. "It's one of the best things about the open range. No matter how tough the day's been, the night sky makes it worthwhile." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars and listening to the night sounds, the occasional lowing of cattle, the soft nickering of horses, the crackle of the fire's embers. It was a moment of unexpected tranquility in what had been days of turmoil and uncertainty. "Do you think he'll follow us?" Josephine asked finally, giving voice to the fear that had lingered at the back of her mind all day. Finn didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Gerald, it's possible, but a cattle drive isn't easy to track or catch up to once it's underway. And even if he did find us, you're surrounded by 20 cowboys who wouldn't take kindly to a man threatening a woman." His confidence was reassuring. Josephine nodded, feeling some of her tension ease. "Thank you, Finn, not just for the help but for understanding. For not asking me to explain or justify why I needed to leave." "Some things don't need explaining," Finn replied simply. "A person has the right to choose their own path." In that moment, Josephine felt a shift in her perception of Finn Kincaid. He wasn't just the cowboy who had broken down the cellar door and rescued her. He was a man with a profound respect for individual freedom and dignity. It was a rare quality, especially in a world where women's choices were so often constrained by social expectations and men's authority. "I should turn in," she said reluctantly, rising from her seat on a log near the fire. "As you said, tomorrow will be challenging." Finn stood as well, towering over her in the firelight. "Sleep well, Josephine. I'll see you in the morning." "Good night, Finn." As she made her way to the tent she shared with Abigail, Josephine found herself wondering what her life might have been like if she had met Finn under different circumstances, if they had crossed paths at a town social or church gathering, rather than through her desperate cries from a cellar. Would they have noticed each other? Been drawn to one another? The thoughts followed her into sleep, where her dreams were a confused mixture of cattle drives, starry skies, and a pair of steady blue eyes that seemed to see right through to her soul. The days began to blend together as the cattle drive made its steady progress toward Cheyenne. Each morning began before dawn, with the cowboys rousing to get the herd moving while the cook prepared a hasty breakfast of biscuits, bacon, and strong coffee. By the time the sun crested the horizon, they were already well on their way, the cattle moving in a constant flow across the landscape. Josephine quickly adapted to the routine of trail life. She helped Abigail with cooking and camp chores, learned to harness and drive the wagon when Curtis needed rest, and even developed calluses on her hands from the various manual tasks that were part of the journey. The physical discomfort of those first days gradually gave way to a hardened resilience she had never known she possessed. Her interactions with Finn were limited by necessity. As one of the newer hands, he was often assigned demanding positions in the rotation, which meant long hours in the saddle. When they did have opportunities to speak, usually at evening meals, or the rare midday breaks, their conversations were brief but meaningful. She found herself looking forward to these moments more than she cared to admit. One evening, about a week into the journey, a fierce thunderstorm blew in from the west. The cowboys worked frantically to keep the herd from stampeding, riding through sheeting rain and deafening thunder. Josephine and Abigail huddled in their tent, listening to the chaos and praying for the safety of the men. When the storm finally passed and the herd was secured, the camp that night was subdued. Several cowboys had taken falls in the confusion, though thankfully none were seriously injured. Finn was among the last to return to camp, soaked to the skin and exhausted. Josephine met him with a cup of hot coffee and a blanket. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice betraying her concern. "Been better," he admitted with a tired smile, "but I've been worse too." He accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping the blanket around his shoulders. "The cattle are settled now. We only lost a few head, which is lucky considering how bad that storm hit." Josephine sat beside him as he drank his coffee, noticing a tear in his shirt sleeve and a nasty scrape beneath it. Without comment, she fetched water and a clean cloth from their supplies and began to clean the wound. Finn watched her work, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "You've changed," he observed quietly. Josephine paused, looking up at him. "Have I?" "Yes. When I first met you, you were like a startled deer ready to bolt at any sudden movement. Now look at you tending wounds, driving a wagon, facing whatever comes with your chin up." There was admiration in his voice and something deeper that made her heart quicken. "I suppose I had no choice but to change," she replied, resuming her careful cleaning of his injury. "Circumstances demanded it." "No," Finn disagreed gently. "Plenty of people face challenging circumstances without finding the courage to grow. What you're doing, that's a choice. A brave one." His words warmed her more than any fire could have. "Thank you," she said softly, finishing with his wound, "for seeing that in me." Their eyes met, and for a moment Josephine thought he might say more or perhaps do more. But the moment was interrupted by the trail boss calling for the men to get some rest while they could. "I should go," Finn said reluctantly, standing. "Dawn will come early, and after a storm like that, the cattle will be skittish." Josephine nodded, understanding but disappointed nonetheless. "Good night, Finn. Be careful tomorrow." "Always," he promised with a small smile, before heading toward his bedroll laid out with the other cowboys under the stars. Watching him go, Josephine was forced to confront the feelings she had been trying to ignore. Somewhere along the journey, her gratitude toward Finn had evolved into something much more complex and powerful. She was falling in love with him, his kindness, his quiet strength, his respect for her independence. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying, especially given the uncertain future that awaited her in Cheyenne. The next few days passed without incident, the cattle drive making good time across the Wyoming territory. The landscape gradually changed, with more rolling hills and occasional stands of trees breaking up the vast stretches of prairie. Game was plentiful, and the cowboys, who were skilled with rifles, supplemented their meals with fresh venison and rabbit. Josephine found herself watching Finn whenever the opportunity presented itself, observing the easy way he sat a horse, the quiet authority he commanded among the other cowboys, despite being new to the outfit, the rare but transformative smile that lit his face when something amused him. She knew she wasn't being subtle, but she couldn't seem to help herself. Abigail noticed, of course. "You've got it bad," she commented one afternoon as they rode side by side on the wagon bench. "Not that I blame you. Kincaid's a good man." Josephine blushed but didn't deny it. "Is it that obvious? Only to anyone with eyes," Abigail replied with a gentle laugh. "For what it's worth, he looks at you the same way when you're not watching." This revelation sent a flutter through Josephine's stomach. "Does he, been watching him steal glances at you for days?" "Man smitten, plain as day." Abigail's expression turned more serious. "Question is, what happens when we reach Cheyenne?" It was the question Josephine had been avoiding. In less than a week, they would arrive at their destination. Finn would be paid for his work on the drive and likely move on to his next job. She would. What? Find work in Cheyenne. Continue on to Denver. The future stretched before her, full of possibilities but also profound uncertainties. "I don't know," she admitted. "We haven't discussed it." Abigail nodded sagely. Men like Kincaid don't typically settle in one place. The trail's in their blood, but sometimes. She let the thought hang unfinished. "Sometimes what?" Josephine prompted. "Sometimes the right person gives them a reason to consider putting down roots," Abigail concluded. "My Henry was a drover for 10 years before we met. Now he's foreman at a ranch outside Cheyenne, and happy as can be with our 3 children." The idea that Finn might consider changing his wandering ways for her seemed presumptuous at best. Yet Josephine couldn't help the tiny spark of hope that flared at Abigail's words. That evening, when the camp was settled and most of the others had turned in for the night, Josephine found Finn sitting alone by the fire, whittling a small piece of wood with his pocket knife. She hesitated, then sat beside him on the log that served as a bench. "What are you making?" she asked, nodding toward the piece in his hands. Finn held it up, revealing the rough but recognizable shape of a horse. "Nothing special, just keeps my hands busy." "It's good," Josephine said, genuinely impressed. "I didn't know you carved." "My father taught me. He was a carpenter before he tried his hand at ranching." Finn returned to his whittling, his hands deft and sure as they shaped the wood. "Not much call for it on the trail, but I find it calming." Josephine watched him work for a while, gathering her courage to broach the topic that had been on her mind. "Finn, I was wondering, what happens when we reach Cheyenne?" His hands stilled momentarily, then resumed their rhythm. "That depends on a few things, I suppose." "Such as?" she prompted when he didn't elaborate. Finn set aside his carving and knife, giving her his full attention. "Such as what you want to do, find work in Cheyenne, go on to Denver, something else entirely, I'm not sure yet," Josephine admitted. "And you? Will you stay with the herd when it's sold, or?" "I haven't decided." His gaze was steady on hers, his expression thoughtful. "For the first time in a long while, I'm finding myself considering options beyond the next job." Josephine's heart quickened at his words and the intensity of his gaze. "What kind of options?" Finn hesitated, then reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. "Josephine, I know we haven't known each other long, but these past weeks, I've come to care for you, more than I expected or intended." The admission, so simply stated, sent warmth spreading through her chest. "I care for you too, Finn," she replied softly. "I can't offer much," he continued, his voice low and earnest. I've never owned more than what I can carry on a horse, but I'm a hard worker and I learn fast. If you were amenable, I thought perhaps we could stay in Cheyenne, together, see if there might be something worth building between us. It wasn't exactly a declaration of love nor a proposal of marriage. It was something more tentative, more exploratory. Yet in its very openness, it felt perfect, an acknowledgement that their feelings for one another were real, but also that they deserved time to grow naturally, without the pressure of immediate commitment. "I would like that very much," Josephine replied, her voice steady despite the emotion welling within her. Finn's smile was like the sunrise, transforming his face and sending light into every corner of her heart. Still holding her hand, he lifted it to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Then that's what we'll do," he said simply, as if they had just agreed on something as mundane as the weather rather than the potential course of their lives. They sat together by the fire until the embers dimmed, talking of practical matters, where they might stay in Cheyenne, what kind of work they might seek, how they would make their way in a new city. Yet beneath the practicality ran a current of excitement, of possibility, of the future opening before them like the vast Wyoming sky. When Josephine finally retired to her tent, it was with a lightness in her step and heart that she hadn't felt since before her father's death. For the first time in years, she was looking forward to tomorrow, not dreading it. And that, she reflected as she drifted towards sleep, was perhaps the greatest gift Finn Kincaid had given her, not just rescue from a cellar, but hope for what lay ahead. The final days of the journey to Cheyenne passed swiftly, the cattle drive making good time across the increasingly rolling terrain of southeastern Wyoming. Josephine and Finn found small moments to be together amid the continuing demands of the trail: a shared cup of coffee at dawn, a brief conversation while watering the horses, a stolen hour by the fire after the others had retired. In these moments, they learned more about each other. Finn spoke of his childhood on a small ranch in Colorado, his parents' struggles to make a living from the unforgiving land, his decision to seek his fortune as a cowboy after their deaths. Josephine shared memories of her father, a kind man who had taught her to read and encouraged her curious mind, and of her mother in happier days, before grief had rendered her susceptible to Gerald Thompson's false charm. The more they talked, the more certain Josephine became that her feelings for Finn were not merely gratitude or infatuation, but something deeper and more enduring. She found herself studying his face when he wasn't looking, memorizing the lines of his profile, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentle strength in his hands when he helped her down from the wagon. Finally, on a clear morning in late June, the distant buildings of Cheyenne came into view on the horizon. The sight brought mixed emotions for everyone in the company: satisfaction at a journey nearly complete, anticipation of payment for their labors, perhaps a touch of regret that the camaraderie of the trail would soon disperse. For Josephine, the sight of Cheyenne represented both an ending and a beginning. The end of her flight from Rock Springs and the beginning of a new chapter in a city where no one knew her history, where she could define herself on her own terms. By late afternoon, they had reached the outskirts of the city. The cattle were guided to holding pens near the railroad, where they would remain until the buyers took possession. The cowboys, their immediate responsibilities fulfilled, made camp one last time near the pens, though many cast longing glances toward the saloons and other establishments of the city proper. Mr. Carson, the trail boss, gathered everyone for a final meal together. He distributed pay envelopes to each of the men, including a smaller one to Josephine for her help with the cooking and camp chores along the way. It wasn't much, but combined with what she had saved from her work at Mrs. Harper's, it would help her establish herself in Cheyenne. As the gathering broke up, with many of the cowboys heading immediately for town, Abigail approached Josephine with a warm embrace. "My Henry's coming to fetch us tomorrow," she said. "We've got room at our place if you need somewhere to stay until you get settled." "Thank you," Josephine replied, touched by the offer, "but I think Finn and I will find lodgings in town. We're going to stay in Cheyenne, together." Abigail's smile was knowing. "I thought as much. Well, the offer stands if you need it, and I expect you to come visit once you're settled." Henry's ranch is just a half-day's ride from the city. With promises to stay in touch, they parted. Josephine found Finn near the remuda, where he was settling Rusty for the night. He looked up as she approached, his smile warming his tired face. "Ready for civilization?" he asked, gesturing toward the lights of Cheyenne, now glowing in the gathering dusk. "As ready as I'll ever be," Josephine replied, a hint of nervousness in her voice. For all her anticipation of reaching their destination, the reality of starting over in a strange city was daunting. Finn seemed to understand her hesitation. "We don't have to figure everything out tonight," he assured her. "For now, let's find a decent hotel, have a proper meal that doesn't taste of trail dust, and get some rest. Tomorrow's soon enough to start looking for more permanent arrangements." His practical approach eased some of Josephine's anxiety. They gathered their few belongings, said their goodbyes to those remaining at the camp, and set off toward the city. Finn led Rusty by the reins, while Josephine walked beside him, taking in her first impressions of Cheyenne. The city was larger and more developed than Rock Springs, with substantial buildings lining the main streets and a busy railroad depot at its heart. Despite the late hour, there was considerable activity: freight wagons making deliveries, travelers coming and going from the station, citizens conducting the last business of the day before heading home. They found a respectable hotel near the center of town, modest but clean. The clerk raised an eyebrow at the dusty cowboy and his female companion, but Finn's dignified manner and prompt payment for 2 separate rooms silenced any potential objections. Their rooms were adjacent, small but comfortable, each with a real bed that seemed luxurious after weeks of sleeping in a tent or wagon. There was even a bathhouse on the premises, a prospect that made Josephine nearly weep with joy after so many days of makeshift washing on the trail. After taking advantage of the bathing facilities and changing into their cleanest remaining clothes, they met for dinner in the hotel's small dining room. The meal was simple roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread with butter, but after trail fare, it seemed like a feast. "So," Finn said as they lingered over coffee, "what's our next step?" Josephine appreciated being included in the decision-making as an equal partner. "We should look for more permanent lodgings," she suggested. "Somewhere we can afford for a month or two while we find work." Finn nodded. "I saw a boarding house a few blocks from here that looked decent. We can inquire there tomorrow." He hesitated, then added, "We should also clarify our situation, for propriety's sake." Josephine understood his meaning. 2 unmarried people seeking accommodations together would raise eyebrows at best, invite scandal at worst. "What do you suggest?" "We could present ourselves as brother and sister," Finn offered, "or as engaged if you prefer." The latter option sent a flutter through Josephine's stomach. "Engaged might be more believable," she replied, trying to keep her tone casual. "We don't look alike enough to be siblings." Finn's eyes held hers across the table, something warm and intense in their blue depths. "Engaged it is, then," he said softly. "For appearances." "For appearances," Josephine echoed, though a part of her hoped even that the pretense might someday become reality. Their first week in Cheyenne was a whirlwind of activity. They secured rooms at Mrs. Whitaker's boarding house, a well-maintained establishment run by a widow with strict but fair policies. Their supposed engagement satisfied her requirements for propriety, though their rooms were on separate floors, ladies upstairs, gentlemen down. Finding employment proved less challenging than they had feared. Cheyenne, as a growing railroad and cattle hub, had need of various skills. Finn was hired as a stable master at a livery near the railroad depot, his experience with horses making him an attractive candidate despite his lack of references. The position came with modest but steady pay and the promise of advancement if he proved reliable. Josephine, meanwhile, found work at a small dressmaker's shop owned by a French immigrant named Madame Rousseau. When Josephine admitted she had only basic sewing skills, the older woman had waved away her concerns. "I can teach you to sew," she had said in her accented English. "What I need is someone honest, with a good eye and a willingness to learn. The rest will come with practice." Their pretend engagement, originally intended merely as a convenience, began to feel increasingly real as they settled into life in Cheyenne. They took their evening meals together at the boarding house, shared their experiences of the day, and on Sundays, walked together through the city's small park. To the outside world, they appeared to be a young couple planning their future together, and in many ways they were. They discussed their goals, pooled their resources, and supported each other's efforts to establish themselves in their new community. The only element missing was formal acknowledgement of the growing love between them, a step that both seemed hesitant to take, perhaps fearing it might disrupt the comfortable rhythm they had established. 3 weeks after their arrival in Cheyenne, as July gave way to August, that rhythm was disrupted from an unexpected source. Josephine was arranging fabric bolts in the front window of Madame Rousseau's shop when a familiar figure passed by on the sidewalk outside. She froze, the bolt of blue calico nearly slipping from her suddenly nerveless fingers. Gerald Thompson stood on the other side of the glass, his cold eyes locking with hers through the window. The shock and hatred in his expression were unmistakable, as was the malicious triumph that followed his initial surprise. Josephine backed away from the window, her heart pounding. How had he found her? Why was he in Cheyenne? The questions tumbled through her mind as panic threatened to overwhelm her. "Josephine, what is wrong?" Madame Rousseau appeared from the back room, concern evident in her lined face. "You look as if you have seen a ghost." "My stepfather," Josephine managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's here, in Cheyenne." Understanding dawned in the older woman's eyes. Josephine had shared enough of her history for Madame Rousseau to grasp the significance of this development. "Go," she said immediately. "Use the back door. I will tell him you are not here if he comes in." Grateful for the woman's quick thinking, Josephine hurried through the shop and out the rear entrance. She hesitated in the alley behind the building, uncertain where to go. The boarding house was several blocks away, as was the livery where Finn worked. Gerald might be watching for her on the main streets. Decision made, she turned toward the livery. Finn needed to know that Gerald had found them. Moving quickly but trying not to attract attention, Josephine kept to side streets and alleys as much as possible, constantly glancing over her shoulder for signs of pursuit. When she reached the livery, she slipped in through the wide doors, the familiar smell of hay and horses providing little comfort in her agitated state. "Finn," she called, searching the dim interior. "Finn, are you here?" "Josephine." His voice came from one of the stalls, followed by his tall figure emerging into the center aisle. One look at her face told him something was wrong. "What is it? What's happened?" Gerald, she said, the name itself enough to convey the nature of the threat. He's here, in Cheyenne. He saw me at the shop. Finn's expression darkened. Are you sure it was him? Positive. He saw me too. Our eyes met through the window. Josephine wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the summer heat. How did he find us, Finn? How did he know to look in Cheyenne? It doesn't matter now, Finn replied grimly. What matters is keeping you safe. He glanced toward the livery entrance as if expecting Gerald to appear at any moment. Did he follow you here? I don't think so. I took the back streets. Josephine took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. What should we do? Finn considered for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. First, we need to make sure he can't take you by surprise again. You shouldn't go back to Madame Rousseau's today. But my job, she'll understand when you explain, Finn interrupted gently. Your safety comes first. He was right, of course. Madame Rousseau had already shown her understanding by helping Josephine escape the shop. Where should I go then? The boarding house? No, Finn decided. That's likely the first place he'll look for you, assuming he asks around town. For now, stay here with me. I'll speak to my employer about borrowing a horse. We'll visit Abigail and Curtis tonight, get their advice. They know people in Cheyenne who might help. The plan was sensible, and Josephine nodded her agreement. Finn led her to a small office at the rear of the livery, where she could wait out of sight while he completed his duties and arranged for transportation. Left alone with her thoughts, Josephine tried to process this unwelcome development. She had known, rationally, that Gerald might eventually trace her to Cheyenne. The cattle drive's destination hadn't been a secret, and if he had been determined enough to follow, he would have discovered where they were headed. But somehow, she had convinced herself that the distance and time would deter him, that he would eventually accept her departure and focus on explaining her absence to her mother. Clearly, she had underestimated his determination, or perhaps his anger at being defied. Either way, his presence in Cheyenne threatened everything she had begun to build here. Her job, her growing independence, and most importantly, her relationship with Finn. When Finn returned an hour later, he had secured not only permission to borrow a horse, but also the remainder of the day off. Mr. Porter understands family emergencies, he explained as he helped Josephine mount a gentle bay mare. I told him my fiancé's estranged relative had arrived in town, causing distress. It wasn't far from the truth, Josephine reflected as they rode out of the city, Finn leading the way on Rusty. The fiction of their engagement had become so familiar that it sometimes felt more real than pretense. In moments like this, with Finn arranging their escape and protection, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, the line between pretend and reality blurred considerably. They rode steadily for several hours, following the directions Abigail had given them before parting ways in Cheyenne. The Jenkins Ranch was modest but well-maintained, with a small house, a barn, and several outbuildings arranged around a central yard. Chickens pecked in the dust, and a milk cow grazed in a nearby pasture. Abigail met them at the door, surprise and pleasure at their unexpected visit quickly turning to concern when she saw their expressions. "What's happened?" she asked, ushering them inside. Over cups of strong coffee at the kitchen table, they explained the situation. Abigail listened intently, her practical nature already considering solutions before they had finished speaking. "He can't force you to go back with him," she said firmly when they had concluded. "You're of age, and Wyoming territory has some of the most progressive laws regarding women's rights. He has no legal claim on you." "That may be true in theory," Finn replied, "but the law isn't always enforced as it should be, and Gerald Thompson strikes me as a man who might take matters into his own hands if legal means fail him." Abigail couldn't argue with this assessment. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need," she offered. "Curtis is away delivering horses to a ranch up north, but he'd say the same." Josephine was touched by the generosity. "Thank you, but we can't impose indefinitely, and we have jobs in Cheyenne, lives we're trying to build." "What if you were truly engaged?" Abigail suggested, her gaze moving between them. "Or better yet, married. A husband's rights would supersede any claim Gerald might try to make." The suggestion hung in the air, both Finn and Josephine carefully avoiding each other's eyes. It wasn't that the idea hadn't occurred to them, it had, at least to Josephine, in quiet moments when she allowed herself to imagine a future with Finn. But to consider marriage now, under these circumstances, felt somehow wrong, a decision forced by external pressure rather than arrived at naturally through the growth of their feelings for one another. "It's something to consider," Finn said finally, his tone neutral. "But not a decision to be made hastily." Abigail nodded, understanding their hesitation. "Of course, I merely offer it as one possibility among many." The conversation turned to more immediate concerns: whether Josephine should return to work at the dressmaker's, whether they should continue staying at Mrs. Whittaker's boarding house, how they might determine Gerald's intentions without directly confronting him. By the time they had finished talking, the sun was low on the horizon. Abigail insisted they stay for supper and spend the night, an offer they gratefully accepted. The journey back to Cheyenne in darkness seemed unnecessarily risky when they had a safe haven for the night. After a simple but satisfying meal, Abigail showed them to separate rooms: Josephine in the small guest bedroom, Finn on a cot in the study. As Abigail left to fetch fresh linens, Finn and Josephine found themselves alone in the hallway between their assigned sleeping quarters. "Are you all right?" Finn asked softly, his concern evident in the gentle lines of his face. Josephine considered the question honestly. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Not just of Gerald, but of losing everything we've started to build here. I like my job, our life in Cheyenne. I don't want to run again." Finn's hand found hers, his fingers warm and reassuring as they interlaced with her own. "We won't run," he promised. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." The simple declaration eased some of the tension in Josephine's shoulders. She squeezed his hand gratefully. "Together," she echoed, finding strength in the word and in his unwavering presence beside her. For a moment they stood in silence, hands joined, the physical connection expressing what words could not fully convey. Then, with a gentleness that made her heart ache, Finn leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead in a soft kiss. "Get some rest," he murmured. "Tomorrow we'll figure this out." That night, alone in the unfamiliar bed, Josephine found herself contemplating Abigail's suggestion more seriously. Marriage to Finn. The thought sent a flutter of both anxiety and excitement through her. She cared deeply for him, loved him, if she was honest with herself. And she believed he returned those feelings, though neither had spoken the words aloud. But was that enough basis for marriage? Her mother had married Gerald Thompson out of fear and loneliness, with disastrous consequences. Josephine had sworn she would never make a similar mistake, never enter a union for any reason other than true partnership and love. Yet as she drifted towards sleep, Josephine found herself imagining a life with Finn by her side, not as a temporary arrangement or a solution to her problems with Gerald, but as a true and lasting bond. And in that imagining, she found a peace that had eluded her since spotting her stepfather on the streets of Cheyenne. Morning brought clarity, as it often does. Over breakfast, Finn and Josephine discussed their options with renewed perspective. They decided to return to Cheyenne that afternoon, face the situation directly, and not allow Gerald to drive them from the life they were building. If he approaches you, Finn advised, don't engage with him alone. Seek help from Madame Rousseau or neighbors. Send word to me immediately. Josephine agreed to these precautions, though a part of her hoped that Gerald, having confirmed her presence in Cheyenne, might have already departed. It seemed unlikely, given his determination to find her, but she could still hope. They said their goodbyes to Abigail after the midday meal, promising to send word of any developments. The ride back to Cheyenne was peaceful, the late summer landscape golden under the afternoon sun. They traveled mostly in comfortable silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts about what awaited them in the city. As they neared Cheyenne, however, Finn suddenly reined Rusty to a halt. Josephine, following close behind on the bay mare, stopped as well, looking at him questioningly. "Before we go back," Finn said, his expression serious, "there's something I need to say." Josephine's heart began to race, though she wasn't sure whether from anxiety or anticipation. "What is it?" Finn dismounted and moved to help her down from her horse. When they were both standing in the tall grass beside the trail, he took her hands in his blue eyes intense as they met her green ones. "Josephine Lawson," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his face. "When I heard your cries from that cellar 2 months ago, I had no idea how completely my life was about to change. I was just passing through, looking for work, expecting to move on as I always had before. But then I met you, and everything shifted." Josephine felt tears forming in her eyes, though she couldn't have said whether they were happy or sad tears. "Finn," he squeezed her hands gently, asking her to let him finish. "These weeks with you on the trail in Cheyenne have been the happiest I can remember. You're brave and kind and stronger than you know. And I've fallen in love with you, Josephine, completely and without reservation." The tears spilled over now, trailing down her cheeks as joy expanded in her chest. "I love you too, Finn," she whispered, the words she had held back for so long finally finding voice. A smile transformed his face, relief and happiness mingling in his expression. "I'm not proposing marriage because of Gerald or because it might solve our immediate problems," he continued earnestly. "I'm proposing because I want to spend my life with you, building something together that neither of us could create alone." Josephine's breath caught. "You're proposing?" "I am," Finn confirmed, his smile widening as he dropped to one knee in the grass before her. "Josephine Lawson, will you marry me? Not for convenience or protection, but because we love each other and want to face whatever life brings together." Josephine didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said simply, her voice clear despite her tears. "Yes, Finn Kincaid, I will marry you." Finn rose and gathered her into his arms, his embrace strong and secure as his lips found hers in a kiss that felt like coming home. All the uncertainty of the past months, all the fear and upheaval, seemed to fade into insignificance in the face of this moment of pure joy and connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing a little faster, Finn pressed his forehead to hers. "I don't have a ring yet," he apologized. "This wasn't how I planned to ask." Josephine laughed, the sound bright with happiness. "I don't need a ring, Finn. I just need you." They held each other for a long moment in the golden afternoon light, the horses grazing patiently nearby, the distant outlines of Cheyenne visible on the horizon. Whatever challenges awaited them, their Gerald Thompson's machinations, the need to explain their sudden engagement to friends and employers, the practicalities of planning a wedding they would face them together, strengthened by the love they had found in the most unexpected of circumstances. As they remounted and continued their journey toward the city, Josephine felt a sense of peace settle over her. The cellar where her stepfather had imprisoned her seemed a distant memory now, belonging to another life entirely. Ahead lay uncertainty, yes, but also hope, love, and the promise of a future shaped by her own choices rather than others' demands. And that, she reflected as they rode side by side toward Cheyenne, was worth any risk that might lie ahead. Their return to Cheyenne was met with mixed reactions. Mrs. Whitaker accepted their now genuine engagement with satisfaction, as if she had suspected the truth all along. Madame Rousseau was delighted for Josephine, but concerned about Gerald's presence in the city. And Mr. Porter, Finn's employer at the livery, offered gruff congratulations along with a warning to keep personal matters from interfering with work. For several days, there was no sign of Gerald Thompson. Josephine began to hope that perhaps he had given up and returned to Rock Springs, though Finn remained cautious, insisting on accompanying her to and from Madame Rousseau's shop whenever possible. Then, a week after their return, the confrontation they had been dreading finally occurred. Josephine was walking from the dressmaker's shop to the boarding house, having stayed late to finish a rush order. Finn had sent word that he too would be working late, so she had set out alone, though she kept to well-lit, populated streets as a precaution. She was within sight of Mrs. Whitaker's when a familiar figure stepped out from between two buildings, blocking her path. Gerald Thompson looked much as she remembered, tall and imposing in his well-cut suit, his face set in lines of cold authority. But there was something new in his expression now, a bitterness that hadn't been there before. "Josephine," he said, his voice carrying the same chill she recalled from their last encounter. "I've been looking for you." Josephine stood her ground, though her heart pounded in her chest. "I have nothing to say to you, Gerald. On the contrary," he replied, taking a step closer. "You have quite a lot of explaining to do. Your mother is distraught, thinking you've run off or come to harm." The mention of her mother sent a pang of guilt through Josephine. "I wrote to her explaining everything. She knows I'm safe." Gerald's expression darkened. "Yes, your letter arrived, full of lies and accusations." Clara was understandably upset. "They weren't lies," Josephine insisted, her voice stronger than she felt. "You locked me in the cellar to force me to marry Mr. Hollister. You took payment for me as if I were property to be sold." "I was securing your future," Gerald countered, his tone reasonable but his eyes hard. "Hollister is wealthy, established. The match would have benefited everyone." "Everyone except me," Josephine replied bitterly. "I would never have agreed to marry a man old enough to be my grandfather, no matter how wealthy." Gerald's facade of reason slipped, revealing the anger beneath. "Your agreement was not required." "As your guardian, I'm 18, Josephine interrupted. "You have no authority over me, legal or otherwise. I've made a life here in Cheyenne, and I intend to keep it." "With that cowboy who helped you escape," Gerald sneered. "Yes, I've made inquiries. Finn Kincaid, isn't it? A drifter with no prospects, no background. You think that's a better match than Albert Hollister?" "I love Finn," Josephine stated simply. "We're engaged to be married." This revelation seemed to genuinely surprise Gerald. For a moment he stared at her, reassessing the situation. Then his expression hardened once more. "It changes nothing. You're coming back to Rock Springs with me where your mother can talk sense into you." "No," Josephine said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Gerald took another step toward her, his intention clear in his menacing posture. "You don't have a choice, girl. I've come too far to leave empty-handed." Josephine backed away, looking around frantically for help. The street was relatively quiet at this hour, with only a few passers-by, none close enough to intervene immediately. She opened her mouth to call out, but before she could, Gerald lunged forward, grabbing her arm in a painful grip. "Don't make a scene," he hissed. "It won't end well for you or your cowboy friend." "Let go of me," Josephine demanded, trying to pull free. When he only tightened his grip, she did what she had never dared do before she fought back. With her free hand, she struck at his face, her nails catching his cheek and drawing blood. Gerald recoiled in shock, releasing her arm as his hand went to the scratch. His surprise quickly gave way to rage. "You little, is there a problem here?" A new voice interrupted. Sheriff James Blackwood, Cheyenne's chief law enforcement officer, stood a few paces away, his hand resting meaningfully on the revolver at his hip. "This is a family matter, Sheriff," Gerald said quickly, his manner shifting to one of respectful concern. "My stepdaughter is troubled. I'm trying to get her home to her mother." "That's not true," Josephine countered immediately. "This man locked me in a cellar in Rock Springs when I refused to marry a man he'd chosen for me. I escaped and came to Cheyenne to start a new life. He followed me here and is now trying to force me to return with him." Sheriff Blackwood's weathered face remained impassive as he looked from one to the other. "That's a serious accusation, miss. Can you prove it?" Before Josephine could respond, another familiar voice joined the conversation. "I can vouch for her story, Sheriff." Finn strode up the street, his expression grim as he took in the scene. He moved to Josephine's side, his arm going protectively around her shoulders. "I'm the one who found her locked in that cellar and helped her escape. There are others who can confirm her account, including Mrs. Harper, who runs the boarding house in Rock Springs where Miss Lawson stayed after her escape." The sheriff nodded slowly, considering this information. "And you are?" "Finn Kincaid. I work for Porter at the livery. Miss Lawson and I are engaged to be married." Finn's voice was calm but carried an underlying steel that impressed even Josephine. Sheriff Blackwood turned his attention back to Gerald. "Sir, it seems this young woman is of age and has made her choice clear. I suggest you accept that and be on your way." Gerald's face reddened with suppressed fury. "This is absurd. She's my stepdaughter. She's 18, the sheriff interrupted, "and under Wyoming territory law that makes her free to make her own decisions. Now, I'll ask you once more to step away and leave the lady alone." For a tense moment, it seemed Gerald might refuse. Then, with a final venomous look at Josephine and Finn, he turned and stalked away down the street. "Thank you, Sheriff," Josephine said sincerely once Gerald was out of earshot. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." Sheriff Blackwood tipped his hat. "Just doing my job, miss. Though I'd advise you both to be careful. Men like that don't give up easily when their pride's been wounded." "We'll be careful," Finn assured him. "And we're getting married next week, which should resolve any remaining questions about Josephine's status." This news, decided upon during their ride back from the Jenkins ranch but not yet widely shared, brought a small smile to the sheriff's weathered face. "Congratulations to you both. If you need a witness for the ceremony, I'd be honored to stand up for you." With that unexpected offer, the sheriff continued on his rounds, leaving Finn and Josephine to make their way to the boarding house. Once safely inside, with the door of the small parlor closed behind them, Josephine finally allowed herself to tremble with the aftermath of the confrontation. "He was waiting for me," she said, her voice unsteady. "If you and the sheriff hadn't come when you did." Finn drew her into his arms, his embrace solid and reassuring. "But we did come, and you stood your ground magnificently. I'm proud of you, Josephine." She leaned into his strength, drawing comfort from his steady presence. "Do you think he'll give up now?" "I don't know," Finn admitted honestly. "But I do know that in a week you'll be my wife, and no one not Gerald Thompson or anyone else will have any claim on you except the ones you choose to honor." The week leading up to their wedding passed in a blur of preparations and precautions. They decided on a simple ceremony at the small church near the center of Cheyenne, with only a few guests, Abigail and Curtis Jenkins, who rode in from their ranch for the occasion. Madame Rousseau, who insisted on making Josephine a proper wedding dress despite the short notice. Mrs. Whitaker, who proved unexpectedly sentimental about the first wedding among her boarders, and Sheriff Blackwood, who made good on his offer to stand as witness. There was no sign of Gerald Thompson, though Finn arranged for one of his colleagues from the livery to keep watch outside the church, just in case. The precaution proved unnecessary, as the ceremony proceeded without interruption. Simple but deeply meaningful as Finn and Josephine exchanged vows and rings before the small gathering of friends. I, Finn, take you, Josephine, to be my lawfully wedded wife. Finn's voice was steady and sure, his blue eyes never leaving hers as he spoke the traditional words. To have and to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. When it was Josephine's turn, her voice wavered slightly with emotion, but her commitment was unwavering. I, Josephine, take you, Finn, to be my lawfully wedded husband. To have and to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. The exchange of rings, simple gold bands purchased with their combined savings, sealed their vows. The minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Finn kissed his bride with a tenderness that brought tears to more eyes than just Josephine's. The small reception that followed at Mrs. Whitaker's boarding house was a joyful affair, with food contributed by all the guests, and even some of the other boarders. Abigail Jenkins embraced Josephine warmly, whispering, I knew from the moment I saw you two together on that cattle drive that this day would come. As the celebration wound down and the last guests departed, Finn and Josephine found themselves alone in the small room they would now share as husband and wife. Mrs. Whitaker, in a rare concession to romance over propriety, had allowed them to move into the boarding houses, one married couple's suite, a modest but private set of rooms on the ground floor. Mrs. Kincaid, Finn said softly, taking Josephine's hands in his as they stood in the middle of their new home. How does it sound? Perfect, Josephine replied, her heart full to bursting with love for this man who had heard her cries and broken down the door that imprisoned her, both literally and metaphorically. Absolutely perfect. Their kiss was different now, not their first, but their first as husband and wife, sealed with promises that neither took lightly. When they drew apart, both were smiling, the joy of the day and the promise of their future together reflected in their eyes. I have something for you, Finn said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small carved wooden horse, similar to the one she had seen him working on during the cattle drive but more refined, the details lovingly rendered. I've been working on it since we arrived in Cheyenne. It's not much, but it's beautiful, Josephine interrupted, taking the carving with reverent hands. Thank you, Finn. My father always said a man should create something with his own hands for the woman he loves, Finn explained, a touch of shyness in his manner that Josephine found endearing. I wish you could have known him. He would have liked you. And I wish you could have known my father, Josephine replied softly. He would have approved of you, I think. He always said he wanted me to find someone who would see me as an equal, not a possession. The mention of fathers turned their thoughts inevitably to family, including the complicated situation with Josephine's mother and stepfather. As if reading her mind, Finn squeezed her hands reassuringly. We'll write to your mother tomorrow, tell her about the wedding. Perhaps now that it's done, Gerald will accept the reality and leave us in peace. Perhaps, Josephine agreed, though she wasn't entirely convinced. Gerald Thompson was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. But that was a concern for tomorrow. Tonight was for them alone the beginning of their life together. A union formed in the most unexpected of circumstances, but stronger for the challenges they had already overcome. Later that night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their new home, Josephine reflected on the strange path that had led her to this moment. From a cellar in Rock Springs to a marriage bed in Cheyenne, with a cattle drive and a new beginning in between. It wasn't the life she had envisioned for herself 2 months ago, but as Finn's arm tightened around her waist, drawing her closer in his sleep, she knew with absolute certainty that it was exactly where she was meant to be. The days following their wedding settled into a new routine. They rose early, shared breakfast in their small quarters, and went their separate ways for work. Finn to the livery, Josephine to Madame Rousseau's shop. In the evenings, they reunited, sharing the events of their day over supper before retiring to the privacy of their rooms. It was a simple life, but a satisfying one. Their work provided enough income to cover their needs and begin saving for the future. Finn talked of eventually opening his own livery or perhaps buying land outside town where they could build a home and keep horses. Josephine's skills as a seamstress improved rapidly under Madame Rousseau's tutelage, with the older woman hinting that she might one day leave the business to her most talented apprentice. A month after their wedding, a letter arrived from Denver. Josephine recognized her mother's handwriting immediately and opened the envelope with trembling hands, Finn watching anxiously from across their small table. The letter was long and emotional, filled with her mother's distinctive looping script. Clara Thompson had finally returned to Rock Springs from her extended visit with her sister, only to find her daughter gone and her husband evasive about the circumstances. When Josephine's letter arrived, explaining Gerald's attempt to force her into marriage with Mr. Hollister and her subsequent escape, Clara had initially refused to believe it. "But something in my heart knew you would never fabricate such a serious accusation," Clara wrote. "I confronted Gerald, and though he denied everything at first, his anger betrayed him. The truth emerged gradually: the arrangement with Mr. Hollister, the payment he accepted, your imprisonment in the cellar. I cannot express my shame and regret at having been blind to his true character for so long." The letter went on to explain that Clara had left Gerald and was now staying with her sister in Denver. She congratulated Josephine on her marriage, expressing hope that Finn was the kind and honorable man her daughter described. She ended with a request to visit them in Cheyenne when circumstances allowed. "She left him," Josephine said softly, looking up from the letter with tears in her eyes. "She actually left him." Finn reached across the table to take her hand. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Josephine replied, surprised to find it was true. "I'm relieved, actually. I've been so worried about her, knowing what he's capable of, but she's safe now with Aunt Margaret." "And she wants to visit," Finn noted. "How do you feel about that?" Josephine considered the question. Her relationship with her mother had been complicated since her father's death. Clara's grief had been all-consuming, leaving little room for her daughter's needs. Her subsequent marriage to Gerald had created further distance between them. Yet despite everything, Josephine still loved her mother and longed for reconciliation. "I'd like to see her," she decided. "To introduce her to you properly, to show her the life we're building here." Finn nodded, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "Then we'll invite her when you're ready." The decision to reconnect with her mother marked another step in Josephine's journey toward healing from the trauma of her past. As summer gave way to autumn, bringing crisp air and golden leaves to Cheyenne, she found herself dwelling less on the cellar in Rock Springs and more on the future stretching before her. There had been no further sign of Gerald Thompson since the confrontation on the street. Whether he had returned to Rock Springs after Clara left him or sought his fortune elsewhere remained unknown. Josephine preferred it that way. The less she knew of his whereabouts, the easier it was to move forward without fear shadowing her days. In October, Clara Lawson, having reclaimed her former surname after leaving Gerald, arrived in Cheyenne for a visit. She was thinner than Josephine remembered, with new lines of worry etched around her eyes, but there was also a determination in her bearing that had been absent during the years of her marriage to Gerald. The reunion was emotional for both mother and daughter. There were tears, apologies, explanations, and gradually, forgiveness. Clara embraced Finn warmly, thanking him with heartfelt sincerity for protecting her daughter when she herself had failed to do so. "I can never repay what I owe you," she told him, her voice breaking slightly. "But I can promise to support your marriage and be the mother Josephine deserves from now on." Finn accepted her gratitude with characteristic grace, assuring her that loving Josephine required no payment or gratitude. "She's the strongest person I know," he said simply. "I'm the fortunate one in this arrangement." Clara stayed for 2 weeks, during which time she and Josephine rebuilt the bond that had been damaged by grief and Gerald's manipulative presence. They spoke openly of Jacob Lawson's death and its aftermath, Clara acknowledging the ways in which her own suffering had blinded her to her daughter's needs. "I thought Gerald would provide stability, protection," she admitted one evening as they sat together in the small parlor of the boarding house. "I never imagined he would try to sell you to that horrible old man." "You couldn't have known," Josephine assured her, though a part of her still wished her mother had been more perceptive, more protective. "He showed you only what he wanted you to see." Clara sighed, her expression sorrowful. "Perhaps. But a mother should see beyond facades where her child is concerned. I failed you, Josephine. I can only ask for the chance to do better now." By the time Clara departed for Denver, promising to visit again in the spring, much of the tension between mother and daughter had eased. They would never recapture the easy closeness they had shared before Jacob's death, but they had found a new understanding, a mature relationship based on honesty and mutual respect. As winter settled over Cheyenne, bringing snow and bitter winds, Finn and Josephine celebrated their first Christmas as husband and wife. Their gifts to each other were modest but meaningful: a new winter coat for Finn, which Josephine had sewn in secret during evenings at Madame Rousseau's shop. A silver locket for Josephine, which Finn had saved for weeks to purchase. Inside the locket, Finn had placed a tiny folded paper on which he had written simply, "For the woman whose courage taught me the meaning of home." The inscription brought tears to Josephine's eyes. "Do you really think I'm courageous?" she asked as they sat before the small fire in their room, the remains of their Christmas supper on the table behind them. "I know you are," Finn replied without hesitation. "From the moment I heard you calling for help from that cellar, you've shown nothing but bravery. Leaving the only home you'd ever known, traveling with strangers across the wilderness, starting fresh in a new city. Those aren't the actions of someone afraid to face life's challenges." Josephine considered his words, turning the locket over in her hands. "I was terrified most of the time," she admitted. "Still am, sometimes when I think about how differently things might have turned out." "Being afraid doesn't mean you lack courage," Finn said gently. "It means you recognize the risks but choose to act anyway. That's the very definition of bravery." Josephine leaned against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence as she had so many times before. "Thank you for seeing that in me, even when I couldn't see it in myself." As the new year of 1876 dawned, bringing with it the nation's centennial celebrations, Finn and Josephine began to discuss their longer-term plans with greater specificity. Madame Rousseau, now in her 70s, had begun to speak more concretely about retirement and the possibility of Josephine taking over the shop. Meanwhile, Finn had earned a promotion at the livery and was saving diligently toward his dream of opening his own establishment. In February, they received another letter from Clara, this one containing surprising news. She had decided to sell the house in Rock Springs, unable to remain in the town where she had experienced such unhappiness. More surprising still, she offered to share the proceeds from the sale with Josephine, acknowledging that the property rightfully belonged to both of them as Jacob Lawson's survivors. "This could change everything," Josephine said, stunned by her mother's generosity. "With that money, we could buy land outside town, build the home you've been talking about." Finn nodded, equally amazed by this unexpected turn of events. "It would certainly accelerate our timeline, but are you sure you want to accept it? The money, I mean. Given its connection to Rock Springs and everything that happened there." Josephine considered his question carefully. The house in Rock Springs held mixed memories for her: the joy of her childhood with her father, the grief following his death, the oppression of living under Gerald's rule. Yet it was also her inheritance, a tangible link to her family history. "Yes," she decided finally. "I want to accept it, not just for practical reasons, though those are compelling, but because it feels right somehow to use what's left of my father's legacy to build our future together. Like bringing something good out of all that pain." Finn understood, as he always seemed to understand the complexities of her emotions. "Then we'll thank your mother and begin making plans. The land west of town, near the creek, might be available. It would be good grazing for horses, with enough space for a modest house and perhaps a small stable." Their dream began to take tangible form over the following months. When the sale of the Rock Springs house was finalized in April, Clara sent Josephine's portion of the proceeds, a sum substantial enough to purchase 10 acres of land on the outskirts of Cheyenne, and begin construction of a small but sturdy house. By summer, the framework of their new home was rising against the Wyoming sky. Finn continued his work at the livery, but spent evenings and weekends at the building site, working alongside the carpenters he had hired and adding his own touches to the design. Josephine divided her time between Madame Rousseau's shop, where she was now effectively managing day-to-day operations, and the domestic preparations for their move, acquiring furniture, linens, and the countless items needed to establish a household. In August, almost exactly 1 year after their arrival in Cheyenne, they moved into their completed home. It was modest by some standards, 4 rooms plus a small loft, with a covered porch running along the front, but to Josephine, it was a palace. Every board, every nail, every pane of glass represented their hard work and shared vision. The day they moved in, Finn carried her across the threshold in the traditional manner, both of them laughing at the formality of the gesture given how many hours they had already spent inside the house during its construction. "Welcome home, Mrs. Kincaid," he said, setting her gently on her feet in what would be their living room. "It's perfect," Josephine replied, turning slowly to take in the space they had created together. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, warming the honey-colored wood of the floors and walls. Outside, the land stretched away toward distant mountains, the creek that had partly inspired their choice of location gurgling peacefully at the edge of their property. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Josephine found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a cellar in Rock Springs to a home of their own outside Cheyenne, It seemed almost impossible that just over a year had passed since that fateful day when Finn had heard her cries and broken down the door that imprisoned her. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" Finn asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "Everything," Josephine replied honestly. "How much has changed since we met? How different my life is now from what I imagined it would be." "Better or worse?" Finn asked, a hint of teasing in his voice though his eyes were serious. "Infinitely better," Josephine assured him, reaching for his hand. "Though there is one change coming that we didn't exactly plan for." Finn's brow furrowed slightly in confusion. "What change is that?" Josephine took a deep breath, a smile spreading across her face as she prepared to share the news she had confirmed with the doctor in town just days before. "In about 7 months, we're going to need that extra room we built in the loft. For a nursery." For a moment, Finn stared at her, processing her words. Then his expression transformed with wonder and joy. "A baby! We're having a baby," Josephine nodded, tears of happiness welling in her eyes. "Yes, our child Finn. A new life born of the love we found in the most unexpected of circumstances." Finn pulled her into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that made her heart swell. "I love you, Josephine Kincaid," he whispered against her hair, "more than I have words to express." "And I love you, Finn Kincaid," she replied, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges lay ahead, parenthood, building their business, the ongoing work of creating a life together, they would face them as they had faced everything else. Side by side, with courage, determination, and an unwavering belief in each other. As darkness fell, and the first stars appeared in the Wyoming sky, Josephine offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the strange, difficult path that had led her to this moment of profound contentment. Her stepfather's cruelty, intended to break her spirit, had instead set in motion a sequence of events that brought her to true love and freedom. It wasn't the life she had envisioned for herself when she was younger, but as Finn's arm tightened around her shoulders, his hand resting protectively over the place where their child grew, she knew with absolute certainty that it was exactly the life she was meant to have. In March of 1877, Josephine gave birth to a healthy son they named Jacob Finn Kincaid, honoring both her father and the man who had become her protector, partner, and love. As she held their child in their cozy home, with Finn beside her and the promise of spring awakening the land outside their windows, Josephine knew that the cellar door that had once imprisoned her was now truly and forever broken. In its place stood open pathways to a future limited only by their dreams, and the boundless love they shared, a love that had begun with a cry for help, and a cowboy brave enough to answer.